Yeah.
Oh, Charlie, you always bring me, you always like explain things to me.
Yeah.
Sometimes wish you were my actual mother. There's several thousand. And I really mean that most sincerely. Yeah.
Right. Shall I get started?
I'm already excited because I like your slide.
Well, thanks so much for coming here. Most of you have at least met me, but I'm Ben. I'm a University of Bristol student, and I've been asked by Content Comms to research the barriers that built environment sector companies face to achieving net zero and decarbonising in general. So, what have I been up to over the last few months? So the bulk of my project was a questionnaire. I researched and found about 300 built environment companies that have UK operations or are wholly involved in the UK. I contacted about 250 of them. I got 29 responses. I asked all of those companies to fill out a questionnaire. I got 29 responses, so about 1 in 9 responded to me, which I was pretty happy about. But the questionnaire was multiple choice by and large, and it felt like I lacked some kind of particular specific information. So I contacted everyone again, saying, would anyone like to do a semi-structured interview with me? And to my surprise, 6 people said yes. So I've also done 6 interviews with representatives of built environment companies. That said, I don't want to present these conclusions as a representative sample of what the built environment company thinks in general. It's very likely that the people that spoke to me were people that have more of a environmental awareness, more of an environmental agenda. To give you an idea of the types of companies, almost all of them were larger companies. 7 in 10 had more than 50 employees. Almost all of my respondents were either, well, essentially all of the respondents were either in executive management roles or they had a specifically environmental focus. This was deliberate because I only wanted to speak to people that had a real knowledge and direct awareness of these problems. And just to give an idea of the spread of types of company, most of them were in construction, that's residential and commercial. Architecture was the second most common. There's a few engineers, a few consultants as well. But when I'm talking about my interviewees, I'm talking about people that work in construction and architecture primarily, so this will be kind of skewed towards them. So just to give you a very kind of crude overall idea of the results of my questionnaire, this is just a questionnaire. Here I've collated all of the answers to the questionnaire within the questions that comprise the 4 categories that Content Comms gave me. So in the project spec, you asked, are built environment companies not achieving net zero because of a lack of knowledge, a lack of incentive, a lack of prioritisation, or a lack of finance? So within each of these categories are 4 to 6 questions. You can see the exact questions on your handout if you're interested. Each of the questions was phrased, to what extent is this a barrier? To what extent do you agree that this is a barrier? So the more respondents agreed, the more significant the barrier was. So looking at knowledge, first of all, you can see that it skews quite heavily towards disagree, indicating that respondents tended to feel that knowledge barriers weren't that significant. They tended to disagree with them. Incentive is a slightly different picture. You can see that it skews towards agree, and incentive has the highest strongly agree bar. About 16% of responses to the incentive problems were strongly agree, which is twice as high as any of the other factors. So it tended to elicit quite strong opinions. So this indicates that built environment companies felt that lack of incentive was quite significant. Prioritisation is a slightly different picture. You can see the most common response was neutral, that they didn't really particularly agree or disagree. This might indicate that the companies were unsure about whether they should prioritise decarbonisation or other things, but it also might be a problem with the questions in the questionnaire. I'll get into that a bit later. But you can see that the prioritisation answers tended to skew towards disagree. The disagree bar is higher than the agree, the strongly disagree bar is higher than the strongly agree, indicating that generally prioritisation problems weren't considered that significant. Finance is a very different picture. Most respondents, they overwhelmingly thought that financial barriers were significant. Note that there's not actually a strongly disagree bar here, which means that of all the financial barriers that I asked about, no respondents strongly disagree with them. So it's to give you a very general overall picture, financial barriers were viewed as the most significant, followed by incentive. Prioritization barriers were viewed as relatively insignificant, whereas knowledge barriers were not considered that significant. So to delve into these in a little bit more detail, when it came to knowledge barriers, built environment companies felt like they had significant knowledge of the strategies and technologies that they need to decarbonise. So when I asked whether it was clear if the green technologies are available, people indicated that they did know what technologies were available. They indicated that they did know how the business might adopt greener practices. So the knowledge is there. Clearly the issue is coming from elsewhere. One of the reasons for this was that decarbonisation strategies and technologies themselves aren't necessarily very complicated. One of the interviewees that I spoke to had been designing he had shown how you could retrofit a council house from the 1940s to make it net zero, and he did this in the year 2000. So he's known how to make these changes for a long time. He said, it's not rocket science, we're not going to Mars, we know what we have to do, the problems come from elsewhere. That being said, if there is a knowledge barrier, it's probably how to measure and verify emissions. For smaller companies, there's less to measure, there's less components to the business, but they might not have a specific environmental or sustainability person. Bigger companies are in the reverse situation. They probably do have people focused on these things, and yet there are more components of the business to measure. The exception is Scope 3 emissions. Obviously, by definition, they are emissions that you can't necessarily control and you can't influence very much. Yeah, one of my interviewees talked about Balfour Beatty. They weren't involved in my research, so I think I'm allowed to say their name. But they recently stepped back from their Scope 3 emissions. They had a net zero target for Scope 3 emissions, and they've recently stepped back from it. An environmentalist like me might look at this and think, well, this is bad news, they're reneging on their former promises. But actually, it's very honest to admit we can't control this. We can't guarantee that we're going to get to net zero in our Scope 3 emissions because we can't control our entire supply chain. So that was a significant knowledge barrier. In terms of incentive, one thing I forgot to say is please feel free to ask questions at any time. I don't mind. I don't mind stopping and delving into something in a bit more detail. There's all sorts of incentive barriers. Obviously, a vast range of things can disincentivize a business from achieving net zero. Things like the government not having adequate legislation, government interests being elsewhere, inadequate incentive coming from NGOs, for instance. And when I asked companies about this, they tended to agree with those barriers. They tended to say, yes, we're not receiving incentive from the government, we're not receiving incentive from NGOs. But interestingly, when I did the interviews, it seemed like the incentive to decarbonise came from quite a wide range of sources, and mostly it was in the interactions that businesses in the built environment have with each other. So when built environment firms are looking at their competitors, if their competitors have a strong ESG agenda, or if their competitors have B Corp certification or UN carbon neutral accreditation, that encourages them to develop their ESG agenda because they want to compete, because they don't want to be perceived as being behind on these issues. One thing that I heard in the interviews again and again was that companies don't want to be first, they don't want to take that step, but they definitely don't want to be last. So companies incentivize each other in this way, even in the absence of government legislation. It's not necessarily that like the rising tide lifts all boats, but it is that the rising tide helps the leakier boats to think, okay, we really need to up our game here. Because I'm talking to mostly architecture and construction companies, they're bidding for projects, and as they bid for projects, the people who they're bidding to can introduce a higher level of environmental standards. So for instance, the government doesn't have a huge amount of mandatory standards and regulations when it comes to net zero, but if a company is bidding for a public sector project, that might come with environmental stipulations, a certain level of environmental management, for instance.
And can I just ask a quick question? Do you happen to know with your respondents whether most of those companies would be doing like domestic, i.e. house building, and domestic stuff, or whether they were working on sort of big commercial buildings?
Yeah.
Do you have any sense of
generally with the interviewees, it's non-domestic things. So I talked to companies that were building schools for the government, that were building like hospitals and things as well. So it does tend to be that. With the interviewees, with the questionnaire respondents, it's so hard to say. And with private sector clients, obviously private sector clients are more concerned about their economic bottom line. However, this is where some of the more luxury buildings get built. And luxury builders often want there to be a higher level of decarbonisation technologies and things involved in those buildings. And so this is useful to them because they can pass on the low or zero carbon status of their building to the consumer as a sales point. So I spoke to someone that had been involved with building student accommodation. They wanted it to be low carbon so that they could advertise to potential students. They worked with a hotel that wanted to be zero carbon so it could advertise itself as a eco hotel. And so all of this encourages businesses to adopt zero carbon strategies and to implement, and when they're putting a bid together, to implement to have low carbon strategies and things within that bid. But that being said, incentivisation remains a major problem and one of the more significant barriers. Moving on to prioritisation. I expected prioritisation to be one of the more significant barriers. Purely coming into this, I thought it made sense that the willingness would be there, but that overall, other things were going to be, at the end of the day, things would be prioritised. The economic bottom line would be more significant. The responses to my questionnaire did not show that.
This is exactly our experience.
Really?
Every single one of those, your italicised actual quotes is absolutely aligned to how we experience things.
Right.
And I think, being blunt, for you and for Sian and for Sophie, that would be totally depressing, because you think, oh my God, I'm coming in, or I'm in the first stages of my work world.
Yeah.
It all looks like everybody really prioritises this stuff, and I know, share a bit about this later, but Sian's had experience of this in her sort of 15 or 16 months with us doing ESG stuff, is that you think it's up there, you think it's the priority, you think everyone's aligned to it, and then, oh, guess what?
Yeah.
The shareholders aren't going to get their return, so we have to drop something, or it's just kicked into the low level bit. Yeah, and that's definitely the overall conclusion that that this came to. But the interesting thing was that in the actual questionnaire, the respondents suggested that they would prioritise other things. They would prioritise decarbonisation above other things. So when I asked, would you prioritise decarbonisation or growing your business, 38% said decarbonisation and 31% said growing the business. When I asked would they prioritise decarbonisation or staying competitive, 38% said decarbonisation, 26% said staying competitive. Sometimes, of course, the balance of where you put your effort is really tricky, because if you've got an energy bill that's gone up 4 or 5 times, and we've got clients where that happened when they had to renew their contracts, you've either got to go in and get more money coming in, more sales, more revenue, more growth, or you've got to find a way to get rid of this enormous burden of the rise in the energy bill. So there's a real seesaw.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So I think what this demonstrates is that the willingness and the interest is definitely there, but at the end of the day, it doesn't necessarily translate to low carbon projects.
It's like it's conditional. The interest can be conditional.
Yeah.
Pending the business doing well, we will.
Yeah. Absolutely. And there's nothing making these things mandatory, which is a big part of the problem, which I will get to. So in terms of financial barriers, it was overwhelming. When I asked, would decarbonising your business involve significant financial burdens, overwhelmingly respondents agreed. And the idea of green investments was difficult too, because they are not considered to have a guaranteed return. And also in the current economic climate, the cost of credit and the cost of investing is much higher than it was perhaps 5 years ago. And even though in the last slide, I mean, we've sort of covered this point, that even though clients, when they're bidding for projects, often that encourages them to decarbonise, maybe more often it discourages them from decarbonising, because if they have greener tech, then their clients won't be prepared to pay. And they don't want to necessarily put low carbon or zero carbon aspects into a bid, because they might lose that job, in which case it was not worth doing in the first place.
Something just to alert you to that you might find interesting for other things that you end up doing is that, I don't know if anybody talked about it, but there are these things called building certifications. So if you're building like a commercial building or a university or something like that, you might choose to have a BREEAM certification or a Well Building Standard certification, something like that. And there is plenty of evidence that shows that if you go down that route, and to get those top level accreditations, you would end up needing to invest in more sustainable tech, building tech. But if you do that as the landlord, the asset owner, building asset owner, you get higher rental premiums over the long term. So because what happens is that, let's just say HSBC or NatWest want to take over a new building somewhere, they will be looking from a brand perspective to get a BREEAM excellent building. So there's an interesting thing there. So with your standard projects, I think it's a real problem to get that green premium in. But if you then get it certified, then you have a marketing tool as the building owner, which does over the long term kind of pay you back.
Yeah, so absolutely. Yeah, one of my interviewees said carbon is the new currency.
That's a fairly.
Consider the fact that if you opt into a low carbon solution now, you save costs in the long run, particularly because you don't have to find other ways to decarbonise. I've gone too far forward. I've gone really too far forward. How did that happen? So offsetting schemes were another, you might not think of it directly as a financial barrier, but my interviewees emphasised that offsetting schemes are often prohibitively costly, meaning everyone goes for the cheap ones. Obviously, when you're spending time and effort considering what offsetting schemes to focus on, that's time and effort that you're not doing everything else that you need to do for your business, so you lose money. Or it has a kind of indirect financial cost. There was a real desire for some kind of reliable verification mechanism for offsetting schemes, knowing what was a good scheme, what would make sense for them to do, and what's legitimate as well, because obviously a lot of offsetting schemes are maybe not quite as watertight as they should be. And also beyond the built environment, broader economic trends have compounded difficulties. So with the financial crisis, with Brexit, with COVID and high interest rates and high inflation rates, it's more difficult to maintain focus on environmental problems. However, one of my interviewees did say that the net zero agenda has built momentum despite all of these things. It's continued to snowball, which is obviously another example of the kind of positive feedback loop I was talking about with companies incentivising each other. There's more than one type of barrier. Barriers to net zero can be direct, but they can also be indirect. They can also drive other barriers. And it felt like political barriers, a lack of effective and consistent legislation, was behind many of the barriers that I've talked about so far. Within academic literature, obviously I'm reading a huge amount for dissertation research, and even when you talk to people that work in the industry, they will say that industry is the problem. And it is. It's not like it's entirely the problem of politics. But there is a real lack of effective legislation and standards, consistent legislation and standards, substantial legislation and standards, that's preventing the built environment sector from decarbonising more effectively. Just to focus on one area in the last 10 years or so, in 2013, the David Cameron and Nick Clegg coalition government decided to cut the Green CRAP, and the Green CRAP was a series of policies, mostly put in place by New Labour, one of which was funding to help ordinary people insulate their lofts and walls. They decided to cut that funding, and the result was this. which was a massive drop off in the amount of loft and in wall insulation. This is a 92% drop in loft installations in 1 year. That never recovered. The number's gone up very slightly, but this is just over 1.5 million loft installations in a single year. There's only 30 million buildings in the UK. So this is really significant, and this being cut was quite catastrophic. The replacement was a Green Deal, which wasn't particularly substantial. That failed within 2 years. The National Audit Office deemed that a failure, so this isn't any political bias coming from me. In the same year, there were net zero carbon buildings regulation, which was scrapped. Since then, about 1 million buildings, 1 million homes have been built in the UK with low energy efficiency standards. The estimated cost in extra energy bills of that is 2.5 billion. So it's really significant. And then there's been things like Boris Johnson's Build Back Greener didn't have any substantial policies as a part of it. So they said they wanted to do hydrogen heating in homes, but they just said, we'll make a decision about it in 2026. They said that they wanted to upgrade any building that had EPC rating of D or lower to at least EPC C, but there wasn't actually a policy in place. It was purely just a stated intention. And the industry gets irritated by a lack of policy certainty. This I thought was particularly interesting. One of my interviewees said that even if today a fantastic new policy that was costed and sensible and substantial was announced, it wouldn't have credibility. Companies wouldn't reorient themselves because they wouldn't believe that it was going to be followed through, because we've had this history of inconsistent policy making. This man split his time between England and Singapore. And in Singapore, they have very consistent government, and built environment companies know that a policy is going to be followed through. In the UK, it's a different story. And this is really frustrating companies. I won't go through each of these individually, but this is every single one of my interviewees saying essentially the same thing, that the lack of legislation means that it's almost impossible for them to commit fully to decarbonisation and really drive net zero. This second last quotation is particularly significant. This is the man who was designing net zero buildings in 2000, and he says that if we were we were world leaders in 2000. If we continue to be world leaders today, he thought every building could be net zero by now. I think this is a bit of a overstatement. I'm not sure that's 100% true, but it goes to show that there is a really significant gulf between where we could be and where we actually are. And the most interesting part of my research was that, to a significant extent, built environment companies are doing it themselves. I've talked about it increasingly making business sense to be greener. Companies want to present themselves as green. They're very aware of how they're perceived within the industry, and when their competitors have certain levels of accreditation or can present a greener bid for a project, that makes companies change. I've also talked about how contract stipulations can incentivize businesses to decarbonise. There was a wide range of industry groups which are taking the initiative that the government has sort of abdicated. I'm sure you're aware of the UK Green Building Council, but they came up several times in the interviews as the ones who are driving the agenda. And then there are policies, there are industry-generated standards and sort of pseudo-legislation which is coming entirely from the industry itself. One of them is the UK Net Zero Building Standard. So this is, according to my interviewee, all of the major institutions across all of the different types of built environment company coming together to define what a zero carbon building means in the UK. Having researched this a bit myself, I think that's a slight overstatement. It's not got universal industry support, but it shows that the industry is sort of doing the legislative legwork for the government, and the government can come in and make this mandatory if they want to. And it's similar with Part Z. These are proposed changes to the UK building regulations. At the moment, there isn't regulations on whole life carbon measurement or embodied carbon. Part Z is an industry-led suggestion to the government of how it could be incorporated into the UK building regulations. And they went to Rishi Sunak's government in 2022, and unfortunately a bill that included this was voted down, but they're planning to go back to the recently elected Labour government and try again. So they're essentially, this is the industry just creating legislation that the government can latch onto. In the absence of government leadership, industry are doing it themselves, to an extent. And finally, just some reflections for you guys. Some kind of key takeaways. So companies are motivated to decarbonise by the way that other companies behave and what they see their competitors doing. Their sense of how they're perceived is super important, and making companies aware of what other companies are doing is a good way to prompt them into action on decarbonisation. There's obviously a need for easily digestible information about net zero. There's a lot of regulations, there's a lot of aspects to this, and a repeated thing that came up in the interviews was that people just didn't have time, particularly in small businesses. It just takes so much time, and that's time that you could be spending doing the other things that you need to do. Every single specialism within the built environment sector can make a contribution to decarbonising, so it's important not to let people off the hook. I spoke to one guy who said that he'd just come out of a meeting with an acoustician who was focused on the noise within buildings, and the acoustician had said, well, that doesn't have anything, net zero doesn't have anything to do with me. But it did, because he's thinking about insulation, and the quality of insulation has a huge crossover with decarbonisation concerns. So emphasise that anyone who works in the built environment sector can make a contribution. When it comes to offsetting, as I mentioned, companies feel like they lack accurate and honest information about offsetting, whether it's good to do in the first place, to what extent, and what projects are legitimate and worthy. Measuring and verifying Scope 3 emissions is a big challenge for all companies, even large ones. And that industry-led legislation, well, not legislation, but industry-led standards and initiatives are gaining traction and may influence government legislation in the future. That is the end. Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Blimey. What are you going to do when I mean, it's really, really good, and you just present so well and with such authority. So, I mean, I'll take my hat off to you.
Oh, thank you.
You could go and do that in a big consulting firm or something, and I think they'd be like, right, get him in, keep him.
This is enough eyes for me, I think.
Yeah, well, no, you did that brilliantly, and it was really well.
And can I just shout out Sean Bell for me?
Well, Sean is
she's
the top potato, and she's brilliant at sort of making sure that, you know,
we have high coaches.
Yeah. So well done, Sean. No, that's really good, really interesting. I do have I sort of almost want to kind of process it and then think about how we.
I've got some observations as to process. This isn't my sector at all. I come from, most of my career spent actually working in supporting organisations that supported disabled people into employment, and actually I was reflecting whilst you were talking on a lot of the similarities between that exercise and this, because they both require a seismic change in attitude, actually. Because if you're looking at employers and saying, I want you to employ more people with disabilities, because actually one in 20 of the working age population is suffering from disability, and actually you're employing within your company maybe 1 in 100. So if you're going to do something to make a change, everything has to change. And what happens is you need government to legislate clearly and compellingly. The same. You need, in the meantime, in order to get that legislation to be something that the next political party doesn't undo, you need societal change to happen alongside the legislation. So those two things have to come together. So that you need, so that for the time, and this happened actually with the minimum wage. When the minimum wage was brought in, everybody went, oh, we can't possibly have a minimum wage, it's a terrible thing, it will put everybody out of business. By the time the government changed colour, everybody was competing for a living wage, which was actually more pounds per hour than minimum wage, because economic drivers, social drivers, and everything else had come together. So not only did the next government not change it, they actually doubled down on it. So I think you can with clear legislation, then the things that happen societally to change things, so the communications, the expectations, how the world changes, that reinforces the legislation in its own way.
Yeah.
And there, so again, we've got echoes of that in this, I think. And actually, I was talking to a friend at the weekend who's, you know, he's a bit of an old boy now, but he's buying, love me for saying that, but he's buying his next new house, and the thing that made him purchase the house he's purchasing was the fact that the builders that are building it have a really strong commitment to putting, you know, to building in a net zero way. So that was their competitive advantages. Tons of new houses being built where he's looking, but that was the thing that made him go, I want that one. And partly it was because his heating bills would be lower, but actually mostly it was because that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting thing how we start to, you know, process things differently.
Yeah.
I think your analysis of the damage that 10 years of really rubbish political thinking has done has been astronomical, actually.
Yeah,
And they started off quite well, and then just because they didn't really mean it, and because it got a bit difficult, it just got chipped away and chipped away and chipped away at.
Yeah.
So I think if you know, with a good run of good policy making, good laws, alongside, you know, the stuff that actually people do want. If you talk to people, you know, this is what they want to see in their buildings. This is what they want the government to do. So I think it looks quite pessimistic, but I actually think it is an optimistic time, because I think actually the societal drivers are in place, and it would take a really daft government not to spot that and legislate and drive it forward. So that's my perspective. Yeah.
I'm so glad you said that, because I need to write a dissertation on this now. And that's,
give her a shout, she's good at this.
Yeah. Maybe you could proofread.
Yeah.
But yeah, like that's exactly the angle that I'm taking, is that like there's a negotiation needs to happen between government and business, and also civil society. And actually civil society has done its bit. The reason why these companies are, they care about how they're being perceived, but the reason that they know that means they need to change is because they know the way they'll be perceived by society is bad if they don't.
It's their competitive advantage if they get it right.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think
So Ben, when you were talking to your interviewees, did you get the sense that there was a gap maybe in what the leadership of their employers wanted and how they ranked the priority of net zero, and then compared to, you know, the workers? You know, was there a gap between leadership and...
Well, the weird thing was that the people that spoke to me were quite senior.
They were?
Yeah,
okay.
like one of them was a CEO, another one was a director.
And they were broadly supportive, weren't they?
Yeah. The smaller companies, definitely. It's generally... They seemed like their companies were on board with what they were saying. I wondered if I'd get some really like bitchy interviewees who were like, you know, I shouldn't, you know, the boss shouldn't be, I hope the boss doesn't hear what I'm saying, but this is what I really think. And it wasn't like that at all. It was, there is a lot of willingness within the industry, but we're hamstrung by this and this and this.
And I suppose the ones that feel negatively probably self-selected by not participating.
Exactly.
So you're weighted towards positivity. But I, you know, when you look at stuff like that, you think, well, actually that sort of resonates, doesn't it? That it's, you know, when you've got competing financial priorities, the thing that isn't the most pressing thing will be the thing that slips down the agenda. That's just so until somebody makes this pressing, it will always slip down the agenda. And then it is complicated because there are lots of you know, and Esther can talk with much more expertise than me, but the business of greenwashing activity is so massive now. So again, there's well, how do we make sure that claims about things that are offsetting, most offsetting is terribly questionable.
Well, I mean, I would say that, you know, Catherine, you told me about Paul buying a house in Malmesbury, which, and I looked at so Catherine's story she's just telling you, so this guy, and I had a look at the website for the developer and this particular development, it said zero carbon homes, and you're thinking, my arse, zero carbon.
How can they be?
But without just a bucket of...
Well, the institutes yet to tie down what it means.
Well, that's exactly what they're trying to do. They're so desperate to tie down what it means.
But
it does mean that they have the power to decide. And if they decide, well, actually, not a very high level, they can just do that. Unless someone's going to force them. They can just decide, oh, this is what we mean by zero carbon.
I think there's a lot of, we did Tori did most of the hard work on it, but we did a report on a sort of like market drivers for a company that do wireless lighting control technology, and they don't really understand the energy kind of market and the net zero sort of driver stuff, so they got us involved, which is our sort of thing. But what was quite interesting was how much of this 60-page document was taken up with short half-page explainers on the government sort of stick beaters, you've got carrots and sticks, haven't you? But so the net zero standard, the REBA smart building overlay, the future homes and building standard, the something else, the UK Green Building Council's framework for whatever. It's bonkers. I don't know how anybody is expected to kind of keep up with any of that stuff. And to, you just want one thing. And one of the big problems is that embodied carbon, I mean, you can correct me because you're the chief geek on this one, but my understanding is there is no agreed standard way of calculating and communicating the embodied carbon associated with a building. And
RICS is trying to
get it on the
way, and they have brought out standard, but it's still open to question how you measure.
And you feel, I've done talks and things on a related subject more around the healthy buildings thing, which of course a healthy building is usually a sustainable one, which should be. And I always feel very concerned when questions start coming out about different standards on embodied carbon. You think, oh my God, I know a bit about this one, but oh blimey, there's another one. So that, and when I've talked to professionals in the built environment, they would say, no, don't worry, because actually this is the problem, and it's a problem for everybody. There are too many ways to measure. We're not comparing apples with apples. So what you want, if you imagine getting off the tube at London Bridge or somewhere like that in the centre of London, low commercial buildings, you want to be able to judge that one with the one over the river, and you want to do it in the same apples and apples way. And I think if we could do that, we'd really understand, because then people who want to rent buildings and invest in buildings, the asset owners, managers, people, whatever, rent lessees, then you can make a choice based on the same language, the same measurements, and that's where it becomes interesting, because then the brand that's buying into it, so Marks and Spencer's need a head office, whatever, they will make an efficient choice, but they'll make a sustainable choice. And what you have to remember is that when you embed sustainability into buildings, you are usually getting a simpler way to run the building, a more efficient way to actually manage and maintain the building, more comfort outcomes, well-being outcomes. So there's a whole load of other stuff that goes in. And
capturing those other benefits is a really important part of the story of why it's a good thing.
Well, we do it. We write about this all the time.
We always do a business case. So, for example, the eco office development will be able to command higher rents because in turn their tenants want better ESG outcomes.
And people want to work in nicer places. It's, everybody starts off from the point of self-interest, don't they? So it does drive changes of behaviours if you can follow that line of logic through the piece of work, I think.
The bit in the pie that I don't know a lot about is kind of like the mass building stuff for sort of like housing associations and social housing provision. But we did co-authored a paper with somebody who's an associate director about 3 or 4 years ago about the sort of the shocking state of the building fabric, a lot of those housing, because kids are getting horrible respiratory issues and what have you, because they're poor ventilation, things like that. There was a child that died, it was a very high profile case. And we wrote a paper which we sort of then we sort of stood by very strongly, really, because we said net zero should be aligned entirely. All the path to net zero, the drive to net zero should be aligned with making those buildings up to scratch from a health and well-being perspective. Because if a 2-year-old can die in its bedroom because it's got asthma because of filth or mould, that is a great wrong. So you've got to look at those dual things and align them together. So again, I don't know whether there's any sort of interest for your studies and what have you, but that's a really big thing.
Yeah.
So twin drivers.
The people that you interviewed, were they doing new builds as well as retrofits in the commercial sector?
Yes. Yeah, they were. Yeah. There was.
So a bit of both.
Yeah, I think we were mostly talking about how you can change buildings rather than what buildings, what they're going to create in the future.
Okay.
So we didn't particularly focus on what the big building projects they were going to do were. But there were major companies who were doing all sorts of things and had like $billion revenues.
I think 80% of the buildings that will exist in 2050 exist now or something. So in other words, we have to make use of what we have. This building here is a great example.
Yeah.
But if you haven't already, give a Google to the is it Marks and Spencer or John Lewis Tory? I think one in London that was on Oxford Street. That's
Marks and Spencer.
Marks and Spencer's, yeah. So give that a Google because that went to the Secretary of State for Department of Communities and Housing. Basically, that they wanted to knock it down, and because they said we can't get this building efficient because it's a sort of 1940s or 1950s post-war build, and then all of the architecture and built environment and green lobby said. That is wrong. All of the embodied carbon's already in it. For God's sake, just sort the build. We can do this. There's some really good people on LinkedIn, like Will Hurst from one of the edits of the architecture magazines, who's worth following because they have, there is a very strong
retrofit first.
Retrofit first is the phrase.
No, and that was a real revelation for me. Like I really wasn't knowledgeable about the built environment sector at all coming into this. And I just assumed that when a building was old enough, that there was just no way to kind of actually make it carbon efficient. But there's all sorts of technologies and things.
So great job.
Thank you.
I just took a photo of that last slide where you said about the kind of the key takeaways or whatever, because offsetting and scope 3 are obviously the two things that are really still confusing people. I think you said at the beginning that there are, with a lot of the net zero challenges, that it's actually not about what do we do because they already know, it's about other things. Whereas it seems like offsetting and scope 3 are major kind of headaches in terms of. So that's just something for us to bear in mind. So isn't it because we've got clients that we create content for, and there's sales and marketing opportunities for them. And if we should be saying to them, well, we probably already know, but we definitely need to be tackling if scope 3 and offsetting is two big kind of content subjects. So, and I don't really know the answer, and I think the trouble is with them, perhaps they don't either.
You're absolutely right that it's a headache, because I think the response to that, especially in a small company, is like, just don't worry, we can't do this. And so there's no effort put in.
Too large pile.
Definitely. I wanted to ask, was anything about that wrong? Because this is going to form the basis of my dissertation, and you guys are experts in the field.
The only thing I would do if I was doing that again, or helping you to do that, is to be clear about what the nature of the businesses were that responded. So I know it's like a smaller, so 30 or so businesses, but we spoke to six architects, we've got 6 architecture firms, 4 building infrastructure, 3 stands, so 10 domestic house, whatever. That would have been really useful for me, and if you were going to send us this, which I that if you would be kind enough to insert a slide that does that, because
I did do this on the first slide, but obviously there's a big pile there
yeah,
too. So that's a kind of general idea. I know I sort of zoomed over
I think
that.
I was probably overexcited at the whole thing. Not actually very good at paying attention. But no, that's really useful.
Yeah,
that's really useful.
and I can, if I do give you the, I can give you some more like data than just this. But yeah, with the program that I made the questionnaire on, you can see each individual respondent, so not only the answers to the questions and what types of company they were, but which company said which specific stuff. I've done a bit of analysis on that. That's actually one of my slides I decided not to do. But yeah, so I can send you this with a bit more information.
Maybe the public-private sector, whether they're private bases in, that makes
I just, it felt like that was, if I look at this and I say, oh well, there's 3 small architecture companies and they tend to say this, like that's such a small sample size.
No, I mean,
I don't feel like I could really make any general.
Yeah, no, fair enough. I think I might have, as I say, I get too if somebody's got nice font to use and placement on the screen, I tend to get distracted by the way things look and not the detail. But no, I think the one that really kind of hit home was, because it absolutely aligned, was the one where you'd quoted the squeeze on the sustainability stuff. Yeah. And as I said, you may or may not have twigged from reading up about Context. We do a lot of stuff, or I've done lots of in the past, Sophie done with me, on the healthy buildings side of things, which is very much aligned to sustainability investments. And my God, that's the other area that gets the squeeze as well. So it resonates. So it totally resonates. Yeah. So I don't think there's anything wrong, Ben. I don't see anything that is sort of stands out as.
All right.
So what's the next steps for you on this?
So I need to ground this in something very like serious and academic, basically. So I think the most interesting part of this is the idea that governments sort of abdicate responsibility. Industry's taken up the responsibility. What you were saying about civil society generating. So Gramsci, the theorist, has a theory of societal stability comes when you have a consensus between these kind of 3 pillars of society. So I'm going to try and tie it into that and talk about how actually a kind of neoliberal economic system encourages governments to take a step back, and it encourages industry to take a step forward. And it because it encourages individualism in people, that's sort of a good thing, because it means that people get a real say when they didn't in the 19th century. And also that companies being given more of a say, the locus of power being closer to companies, might be a good thing if some of these companies are doing the right thing. Except
that your Singapore example, of course, speaks against that, doesn't it? Because what that's really saying is actually, if you've got a government that is almost always in power, and it decides what it wants to do, and it is so, then it has the capacity to be incredibly long-termist. Because that's what it is. So that's the slight, well, there's a slight counterbalance to that argument. That just needs a bit of unpicking. I think the evidence is strongly in favour that you need those 3 pillars, and there's lots of examples of how that change, creates change. But it does need each of them to do their bit. And that's where this has fallen down.
I think I counter that comment by saying that Singapore is essentially a benevolent one-party state.
Exactly that, yes.
And so that's good if it's doing the right thing. But all it would take is a few people at the top of the state to decide net zero is a bad idea. And that would be that. Whereas our shared power means that we can at least fight.
I'm not arguing for dictatorship, but the example given by your interviewee was actually saying, well, of course, because it has decided these things are important, and actually they've done lots of brilliant stuff in Singapore. It was one of the most corrupt countries, and it's now one of the least corrupt countries. So they've made huge progress in lots of areas. But yes, it just takes some people to decide that's the wrong thing and everything falls apart. But I think what it does show is you do need what that shows you is you need the evidence. It's the evidence that the government has to do its bit well. And our government, I think, has failed to do its bit well on lots of things. and this is a really prime example of you know, more focus on headlines than action from the government, and that's because you've got too many politicians that were journalists and not intelligent people. But there we go. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting.
There would be, I was going to say, there would be so many other carrots. We're talking about carrots and sticks.
So many.
There would be so many other carrots you could use if you wanted to make the market move towards the net zero agenda.
But like the feed-in tariffs, going back to the norms, they were quite effective.
Well, I'm not so sure actually, Tori.
No?
No, because they were stop-start, and what happened is that, so we got caught in this in the supply chain. So what happened with them is that the way that they were released was that they were in chunks. And so everybody used to run, it's like doing you're the athlete, run to an end line. We have to meet the line to hit the deadline of the feed-in tariffs, and then it would stop a bit. And then so it artificially inflated the sort of speed and acceleration of the opportunity. And then the market had to behave weirdly in order to deliver on demand. And there should have been, I mean, I'm not clever enough to work this one bit out, but there should have been more organic, I think, more organic ways to have a similar impact for the end number, but to not artificially. It's like putting a flipping insulin boost in it. It's like, oh my God, you're doing up like this all the time. And what happened is that the companies who were delivering under that feed-in tariffs,
encourage mispractice.
So yes, they had to move really quick. Bad installs. They failed. They then went bust because then the government would say, we're not going to quite do that amount of money next time. And people like us ended up being owed money by companies who were reliant on the feed-in tariffs to keep their businesses afloat.
Right.
So the cash flow.
And I'm really happy to take that into a separate conversation with you if you want. Because
when you say us,
we
were working with content comms, or was this?
Content comms.
Right.
So we would be doing PR and comms for companies in, let's say, the solar sector.
Right.
Those companies were growing their businesses rapidly and far too quickly because they were responding to the market demand, stimulated, stimulated by the feed-in tariffs. And then the government would suddenly have a different hair day and say, we're not going to do that now. We're going to, after phase 2 of the feed-in tariffs, we're not going to do that. Or we're going to do a smaller pot. And once the pot's gone. So that then meant balloons were being burst like that all over the place.
But it could be an example, like case study for your research about how policy and action.
Carrots and sticks. Esther spends her whole life really, and Sophie, communicating and disseminating information about energy compliance stuff, usually into industry, but also into people who've got buildings as well. But this thing about carrots and sticks is fascinating, and if you were doing more on that in your, what is the better route? Do we give everyone a good beating, or do we incentivise, make things? The VAT issue, you can't get VAT on retrofit. You can only get VAT relief on new build. Bloody idiotic. That's the sort of insane nonsense.
That came up in one of the interviews.
Bound
to. As did the feed-in tariff. Someone said, but it was just a kind of offshoot of what they were saying. They said that it used to be more economically beneficial. It made more economic sense to fit PVs. And now it makes less economic sense, even though they've got so much more efficient and cheaper as a kind of as a unit price. It makes less economic sense now.
Obviously, it feeds into the bigger picture, which is that you need electrification of energy really, so that these buildings are sources, which is going to be a theme of the World Green Map.
The buildings have got to be brought up. They can't be as they are. As you say, they need to be electrified, they need to be retrofitted, they need to be efficient, they need to be smart, they need to be intelligent, they need to be connected. Connected is the big thing in all this. They need to be batteries in their own right, they need to be able to release and demand, energy demand ladders.
And that's infrastructure and stuff, which is why you need the government.
So all that stuff.
But it's also great business for these companies, right? Like it's so much, like they could make they would have so much business as a result of that if it was like widespread, if the government really committed to making sure that the building stock of the UK was
right.
I think in the domestic market there does need to be that financial incentive. I mean, I can understand the point about, you know, it being shaky and a drop off, but how are you going to persuade someone who's just kind of trying to make ends meet that, oh well, you should do insulation, you should put in a heat pump, you should put solar panels on your roof.
Well, the heat pump one was a classic, because we got a heat pump and we took advantage of the government scheme to put our heat pump in, and it was a government scheme that basically only benefited people that could afford the cash up front. So you needed to have, you know, £10,000 in the bank. So it was a middle class scheme. Basically, because you needed to have the money in the bank to pay for it up front in order to get the cash back over 7 years. It's a classic example of a terrible programme.
There's a story on the back of this about a woman who was an architecture company that were retrofitting schools, but so many schools in the UK are so old that if they wanted to fit heat pumps into the school, but they found that it actually wouldn't help them to heat the school because all the windows and doors were so old and leaky. They just about had enough money for the heat pumps. They didn't have enough money to retrofit the rest of it. So what they did was they just put gas boilers in. So this company who had everything, the whole plan and the willingness and the incentive and the money, ended up making the situation worse.
That happens a lot, I think.
I can bore you witless separately about heat pumps in schools, because we have a lot of our, we've heard about a lot of epic engineering failures on that, and then what's going to happen is give it 2 years, they'll be whipped out, gas ones will be back in, guarantee it.
So
well done, Ben.
What's your what do you think you've learned from this, apart from the what's going into your dissertation?
Oh, what a question. Everything in that is stuff that I've learned from this, literally. I mean, it's hard to summarise in general. The overarching thing that I'll take away, the thing that I'll remember in 20 years is that people do really care about this. Even within corporations, even people who are making cold hard financial decisions all the time care a lot about this.
That's interesting.
So but this is a small sample size. It just feels like in general. I don't know if I feel more optimistic or pessimistic as a result.
Well, the thing is, Ben, at some point when you're running a corporation somewhere and you're making decisions and influencing all this, promise that you'll remember this today, and you'll think, well, actually, your people like you know, are in the position to make massive changes in your careers into the world, because you know they're kids that need something decent to grow up in, which I think is largely why we're all doing it deep down. But you know, I think the things that you're learning and you're making happen, it's really important that you sort of keep optimistic, because if we don't, we're all in absolute shit, basically. So we have to keep making it. And Sean, I think, has had a real rude awakening into the world of work by seeing a couple of FTSE listed companies that we work with, one in particular, who really have said that they put the environment first, but when it comes down to that and the shareholders bonus, they don't. And what I hope one day is that when Sean's in those positions, or you, or say whatever, or any of us, that we try and stick to our principles of choosing right over wrong.
Definitely, This Gramsci guy that I'm going to use for my dissertation said optimism of the will, pessimism of the spirit. So you sort of don't believe that that people in general are going to do the right thing, but you act as if they are.
I think that's
that's a good place. I do get your little book open and say thank you, because I thought we could do. I didn't know if you liked it, because I thought better not get chocolate, but flowers.
That's like the perfect.
So thanks. Thanks very much for. You even get a complimentary.
And you worked out, so now I know what's inside. It's not
Well, it's just that that's my personality. I can't keep secrets.
Doesn't do gifts.
I usually buy presents in September for Christmas, and then never really what they've got.
It's
very childlike, yes. But seriously, we're well impressed with that. And Sean, thank you for all you've done. And I thought your presentation, your ability to present was really, you
Excellent, I really enjoyed that.
Okay, what's
Yes,
next?
and thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Really. So there's probably some next steps about what we do with this.
Yeah.
I'd probably
So you have a conversation about that. We don't need to do that now, but we need to